Here's a theory. The Third World War is already on. We just don't see it like that. And one country is making some brutal but winning moves. China relies on stealth and deceit, strategic moves that are not entirely confrontational, moves that do not cause immediate shockwaves, tactics that are hiding in plain sight. Tonight, I have 5 very important developments that will tell you how China is exploiting a crisis of its own making. 5 steps. First, selling the world medical gear after making them sick. Second, taking over distressed companies after damaging the global economy. Third, stockpiling cheap crude oil after causing an oil price crash. Fourth, hoarding grain as the world faces a potential famine. And fifth, pumping money into the WHO to control global platforms. This is the plan, and it's already in action. We've already reported in detail about China's substandard gear, the medical gear that it's selling the world, and attempts to buy distressed companies the world over. So we'll focus on the 3 latest moves tonight. Number 1, Chinese investments in the WHO. They have shot up after the US decided to freeze funds. China has decided to donate another $30 million to the WHO, and that too in cash. This is in addition to the $20 million Beijing previously committed to the health body. Until recently, the United States was the largest donor to the WHO. China was contributing around $40 million every year. That is fast changing. China is on its way to becoming the biggest donor to the World Health Organization. China says it is doing so, in their words, to strengthen the health systems in developing countries. We're not sure about that. Here's what it will definitely strengthen, though: China's control on the World Health Organization. Step number 2, China is stockpiling cheap crude oil after oil prices hit rock bottom. China is buying tremendous amounts of crude oil. Prices have collapsed thanks to the slowdown post the Wuhan virus. The world is running out of storage space. Governments across the world are spending on healthcare instead, and they don't have space to store this oil. Oil prices went into the negative. China, though, has space for more oil, and it has the money to spend. The coronavirus is not as big a problem anymore, it appears. So here's what's happening. Chinese imports have risen by 4.5% last month. Beijing says it is buying more to save the oil industry. How generous. The reality is China is filling its strategic oil reserves. According to one report, China has filled up 65% of its commercial reserve capacity. The Chinese regime is growing more and more self-reliant. Step number 3. China is hoarding grain as the world faces a potential famine. China is buying more and more crops. Reports say 30 million tons at least. China plans to add about 10 million tons of soybean, 20 million tons of corn, 1 million tons of cotton to its state reserves. The bulk of these crops will be imports, mainly from the United States, of all places. The timing is perfect. The US government badly wants to reopen its economy. The coronavirus has muted demand in America. The prices are at their lowest. Beijing wants to make the most of it, and it is. It plans to stockpile crops and release them to whoever and whenever it wants. It also helps China fulfill its trade deal obligations with the United States. For this year, China has agreed to step up its purchase of US goods, $12.5 billion above its baseline for 2017. China is exploiting a crisis of its own making. It is silently working on a post-pandemic power grab, and the world needs to be alert to this.
All right, so let's start with the big story that we're tracking on WION at this hour, where the state of Missouri in the United States is suing China over the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the lawsuit has been filed in a federal court, and it seeks damages from China for having covered up the pandemic. Now, Missouri is led by Donald Trump's Republican Party. The Attorney General's lawsuit is in line with the President's criticism of China. It accuses China of lying about the virus and also having silenced the whistleblowers. It has also accused the leadership in China of negligence, resulting in enormous death and suffering all over the world. Now, this, in fact, is the first legal effort anywhere in the world that seeks accountability from China. Meanwhile, in China, a human trial is presently underway for a possible vaccine. We're being told that tens of volunteers are part of this trial and that the results so far are positive. Now, the vaccine targets the initial strain of the virus and a few early mutations, and herein, of course, lies the big challenge. Now, ever since the outbreak started in Wuhan, the novel coronavirus has mutated, according to reports, into as many as about 4,300 variations. In Wuhan, the administration is also distributing coupons to residents, and these coupons can be exchanged at restaurants and transport hubs and are aimed at encouraging spending and also at kick-starting the economy. While much of China is now returning to normal, one city in China's northeast has, of course, tightened travel curbs after a surge in COVID-19 cases. Now, Harbin is the capital of the Heilongjiang province that borders Russia, and it is now dealing with an influx of cases from its northern neighbors. Non-locals are banned from entering residential zones. There are similar rules for vehicles from other parts of China as well. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of how China, of course, is responding to this talk of cases being filed against China to hold China accountable for the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are joined in by Patrick Falk, who's joining us live from Beijing. Now, good afternoon to you, Patrick, and let me, of course, begin by asking you in terms of what has happened in the state of Missouri in the United States, where the state of Missouri has now decided to sue China for negligence and for resulting the COVID-19 pandemic in developing into a global pandemic. How are the Chinese responding to this?
Well, there's certainly no official response coming from the Chinese, and it does seem unlikely that there will be. This isn't the first lawsuit of its kind that's been made against the Chinese government, but it is, as far as we understand, the first by a U.S. state, essentially accusing China of covering up the coronavirus outbreak or the extent of the outbreak, particularly in the beginning months, and also not making it clear about the ability of the virus to transmit from humans to humans in the early months of the outbreak. As I say, though, not likely to get any response as such from the Chinese. As one commentator has already put it, if we can start going after governments about these sorts of things and the economic trouble that they have caused, then a lot of people are going to be putting their hands up and pointing the finger at the US over the 2008 global financial crisis. However, this is indicative of the environment that we're in, and there is a sort of growing backlash from Western governments in particular against China over what has happened. And in particular, there has been a development from Australia with the Prime Minister there saying that he had been in overnight calls with President Trump, as well as the leaders of France and Germany, calling for a probe into the origins of the virus. That still isn't something that is clear at this point, and China has hit back and accused Australia of parroting these claims that are being made by the US. We also had China's ambassador to the US hit out at President Trump for making the allegation that China had intentionally perhaps pushed this virus on the rest of the world. So it does seem as though the atmosphere between global leaders against China is stiffening,
right.
But as far as we understand, with the lawsuit that's being made against China, no response as of yet.
Absolutely. And also, there is this talk of, reparations that China may have to pay. This is something that is doing the rounds. There was a paper in Germany that spoke of reparations to the tune of almost about $160 billion. There are also talks that perhaps because China has lent out so much money to African nations, different African nations, and because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic activity has come virtually to a standstill, and therefore China must not try and ask these African nations to repay some of these loans. How is China looking at all of this talk?
Concessions, if you like. There's no precedence for it, as far as we understand, and China in many ways feels that it's trying to do what it can to support countries that are grappling with the crisis at this time.
And also one quick question, just before I let you go, Patrick. There are reports of certain cases of infections where people had first completely recovered and then they again tested positive for COVID-19. How much of a concern is this within China? I think there seems to be a problem with the line there with my colleague Patrick Fox. So this of course, is the big story where the state of Missouri has now gone ahead and sued China for negligence and also for bringing about and causing the COVID-19 pandemic. How all of this, of course, pans out is something that will be seen in the coming days.